Thank you guys for the opportunity to chat a little bit about wind. It's always a fun topic for me. This is what I get to do all day, every day. And excited to share with those of you who may not be as familiar with wind in the Southeast, or may just have the giant question of what is wind in the Southeast and how might we see utility adoption of wind in the Southeast going forward. So just a really quick overview of the Southeastern Wind Coalition. We are an outreach and education organization. We are based in North Carolina. There are three of us, but we cover a really wide footprint. Our footprint goes from Virginia down to Florida and over to Louisiana. We work on land-based wind, offshore wind, as well as wind imports. So you'll see here, our role is working with a wide variety of stakeholders. So we work with utilities, with legislatures, with regulators, other NGOs, and everything in between. It really just depends on what's going on in the state. So hopefully today you'll get a sense of what is going on in North and South Carolina. All right, so I always like to start with kind of the big picture of what does wind look like across the country versus what does it look like in the Southeast. So you can see here our big question mark for the Southeast. Why is that? The primary reason is wind resource. So you can see here most wind is developed at around, or in the past has been developed at around an 80-meter hub height. And this is a wind map. You need at least 7 meter per second wind speeds to have kind of commercially viable wind. And you can see here, I think most of us know that wind is in the Midwest, also offshore North Carolina. So how do we access some of that? So the way that we access wind is going to be through higher hub heights and a larger windswept river area. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but you can see here that taller towers give us higher capacity factor and lower wind costs. This is, I think, gives you a good sense of what's been going on. Since 2000 to 2019, we've seen average hub height go from 58 meters to an average of 90 meters, and it's actually gone up quite a bit since then in terms of what we've seen for new hub height requests. So we expect that to continue to go up. Well, why is that? You can see here this graphic shows in the past at 80-meter hub height, what kind of wind resource could you actually develop in the Southeast? And it's in the slim to none category. It's all ridgeline. But then once you look at 110 meter, you can see there it's not very granular for North and South Carolina, but you can see that you've got a pretty significant amount of wind resource that covers. And then let me see. Oh, there we go. Perfect. And then when you look at the future 140-meter hub height, you really the wind resource is fairly unlimited. So why don't we always just build at 140 meters? It's expensive. It's brand new technology. We are starting to see some of that technology open up. DOE is spending a significant amount on that technology. There are a number of companies that are looking into how can you create turbine bases that are that have a concrete base followed by a steel tower. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff, but still somewhat early stages. Let's see. Okay, great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about wind projects in the Southeast. This is always the fun and interesting part. The Amazon Wind Farm US East by Avangrid Renewables. I just want to double check my. Okay. The one project that's in the Southeast, aside from there's a small project in Tennessee, you might have seen Tennessee has 28 megawatts. It's a really old TVA project. It was built by TVA and Invenergy. But this is really our first large utility scale modern wind farm in the Southeast. This was a $400 million investment for the project located in Pasquotank and Perquimans counties. It's about half and half in between the counties. It was fully constructed in December of 2016 and commercial operation began in February of 2017. The project is 104 turbines. They are 2 megawatts each. So total project capacity is 208 megawatts. So a significant project. This is all constructed on farmland in those two counties. The footprint is about 22,000 acres. But one of the fantastic things about wind is that the footprint that is actually made unusable to previous uses is very small. So only about 200 acres are required to be to be removed from farming and put into energy production by a 208 megawatt wind farm. So significant. And that includes the wind turbines, roads, substations, and the O&M building. And then I mentioned this covers 60 landowners. One of the reasons that is so important is because of the economic development benefits. So each of those landowners receives $6,000 a year per turbine. So a landowner that's got 2 turbines, just increased their average annual income by around 20% based on median family income in both of those counties. So I've got some fun pictures, always exciting, groundbreaking ceremony, construction. Wind is one of those things, if you haven't seen a wind farm up close or certainly one under construction, they are significant capital intensive projects. So capital and resource intensive projects. You can see the turbine foundation is the steel grates, and then that's all filled in by concrete. So they have concrete manufacturing running almost 24/7 for a good month to create enough concrete to fill in those bases. And then the components in transport, land-based components are still transported via rail and ship. You can see those here. And then this is the project in full commercial operation. So what's fantastic about this is you can see that farming continues right up to the base of the turbines. There's this land area is pretty swampy. So you can see some of the water kind of pooling around those turbines. There's a lot of engineering that went into making sure that the bases of those are stable, given some of the wet land around there. This used to be a swamp. It was drained 200 years ago for farming. So you can see the canals. And one of the other benefits of the project actually is that they built about 60 miles of new roads. And these are all, these are 18 inches of new gravel because they've got to really have significantly reinforced roads to bring in these very heavy components. But this allows the farmers actually a whole lot more access to their land, given how wet their land is. They weren't able to to get crops out if there had been any rain at all. And now they've got these reinforced roads instead of dirt, which turns to complete mud. I'm sure you can imagine from this. They've got these great roads to actually go in and get their crops out. There is one other wind farm currently under development in North Carolina. It's the Timber Mill Wind Farm by Apex Clean Energy, located in Chowan County, which is adjacent to Pasquotank Perquimans. It would be 173 megawatts, enough to power about 40,000 homes. So it's only 48 turbines. Mentioned earlier technology shifts, and not only are the blades getting longer and the heights getting higher, but the generators are getting larger and larger. It's a whole lot more efficient to use the same footprint and have a larger turbine on top of that tower. These projects I mentioned, with the Amazon project, I neglected to mention that's the largest taxpayer in both of those counties, larger than the Walmart, larger than the electric utility. Dominion is the electric utility in that part of the state. So it's really truly a significant economic development benefit. You can see here the landowner payments, over 100 full-time jobs during construction. And if this project is permitted, it would be the first to go through. North Carolina implemented a state-level wind permitting process in 2014. The Amazon project was permitted before that, and so no project has been through the state permitting process yet. I'm happy to share more about the status of those projects and projects in general if that comes up during Q&A, but for now, I'll leave it there and keep going through the slides. Wind imports are, could be a significant source of our ability to diversify the generating portfolio, especially for our IOUs in North and South Carolina and truly across the Southeast. You can see here, there's already almost 4,000 megawatts of wind imports. A big chunk of that comes into TBA, and this is for the entire Southeast. So the best, you saw the easiest wind to access. So wide swaths of open farmland, really strong winds, lack of other development so that you're not, wind farms can't be built in places where you've got a lot of residential development. And so the Midwest is ideal. And so it can be very cost effective to bring these in. There was a line, there was a company called Clean Line that was started up probably about 10 years ago to see if a commercial entity could build high voltage direct current lines from the Midwest to the Southeast. They had a number of lines under development. They faced a lot of different pushback and didn't get a lot of help from the federal government to help with permitting. And so for now, those are no longer, Clean Line is no longer in business, and those lines were never developed. But the idea behind it was building these large lines to bring in significant amounts of renewables to really diversify, not only to diversify the portfolio, but when you think about the time of day when these projects are generating energy, it's clearly going to be very different than the time of day, both that solar's generating in the Southeast and also that any Southeast wind is generating. So would be significant in terms of diversifying portfolio. Offshore wind is kind of the latest and greatest, and certainly the resource that's been talked about the most over the last 2 years. So I'll get into a little bit of why that is. You can see here the night sky, always an interesting photographic evidence of exactly where we are using energy. And it is primarily along the coast. Now, one of the interesting things here that I know I didn't think about as much until I really started digging into transmission assets and what it takes to bring offshore wind onshore. The Northeast coast has significant load centers right on the water. And so you're not forced into bringing transmission or into constructing a lot of new transmission on land. The Southeast, you can see our load centers are further inland. So I think one of the challenges, the up and coming challenges for offshore wind in the Southeast is just going to be land-based transmission and bringing that resource into the load centers. Here you can see a wind map overlay and significant resource all up and down the East Coast, really about midway through South Carolina. One of the other fantastic things about offshore wind compared to land-based wind is just the generating profile. The generating profile for offshore wind matches very well with summer demand. Offshore starts blowing in the afternoon. It's just, for those of us who go to the beach in the morning, it's kind of quiet. And then by afternoon, that wind really starts picking up. So it's got a fantastic load profile that matches the demand profile quite well. You saw from the resource map as well, North Carolina, South Carolina have phenomenal wind resources, offshore wind resources, but more importantly, we have phenomenal wind resources that are relatively close to shore. You know, the further offshore you go, the more expensive it's going to be. You can make some of that up sometimes if the wind resource is often better the further offshore you go, but you're also then thinking about not only the cost of transmitting that electricity back to shore via subsea cables, but also you really the development companies and the operating companies have to think about these turbines require daily operating and maintenance services. Not each one, but you know, if once you've got a system of offshore wind turbines, you've got to have somebody out there almost every day, depending on how large that wind farm is, providing O&M services. So the further out they have to go, the more time they spend in transit, that gets very expensive. So there are, you know, for the really large wind farms in places like the North Sea and other areas where the resource has been developed with larger and larger wind farms already, they've got vessels that are floating hotels, and they take the O&M staff out there for 2 weeks at a time, and they operate more like the oil and gas industry, where they're 2 weeks on the water, 2 weeks off the water. But if you have a small wind farm, it doesn't really make sense to do that. So what's the status of offshore wind in North Carolina, South Carolina? This is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which is they're better known as BOEM. BOEM is the federal agency that is responsible for leasing offshore wind areas. You can see here North Carolina has 3 identified wind energy areas. Kitty Hawk up in the northeast, and then there's Wilmington East and West down contiguous with the South Carolina areas, which I'll show next. Only one of these has actually been leased. The Kitty Hawk area is under lease. The other 2 are just identified, and BOEM requires an interagency task force that is also comprised of state level officials to have a number of different meetings to discuss how and when and where these wind energy areas will be leased. And it's now called the Carolina Long Bay area has not had a task force meeting in years. So we're still not sure how, when, if any of those southern areas will be leased. So just diving into the Kitty Hawk area really quickly. The Kitty Hawk area is 122,000 acres. And this is actually a little out of date, which is kind of funny how quickly the technology has changed. When the area was, even just up to last year, we're looking at up to 2,000 megawatts of generation in this 122,000 acres. Now, with the larger turbines in the 12 and 14 megawatt size per turbine, we're looking at much closer to 3,000 megawatts of generation in the same footprint. This project doesn't begin until 24 nautical miles offshore. I mentioned it is already leased, and Avangrid was the winner of that lease, which is also the developer of the land-based project in North Carolina. And they were awarded that lease for just over $9 million. Began environmental surveys in June of 2019. And they don't have a buyer, so they don't have an in-service operation date, but I think they're estimating sometime around 2026. I throw this in here because it is important to note that just north of the Kitty Hawk lease is the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind project, or known as CVOW. CVOW is constructed. You can see here expected to be completed by May 2020. It is constructed. I actually had the opportunity to go out on a boat and see the turbines live about a month ago. But this is a two turbines, 6 megawatts each, which gives you a sense of just how quickly the size of your average offshore wind turbine is increased. They tried to increase the size from the 6 megawatt turbines, but because they were already permitted at 6 megawatts, it was not feasible at the time. So those will be up and running, and Dominion has plans now for a 2,400 megawatt project that is, you can see here, contiguous with the other lease area. All right, so South Carolina call areas. On this slide, you can see I mentioned that BOEM has combined the southern part of North Carolina and South Carolina into one regional task force area. It's called the Carolina Long Bay. So Carolina Long Bay has Wilmington East and West identified. And then you can see for South Carolina areas identified, there are 4 call areas. Again, there's been no movement on these in years, so those areas could very well, and I would say it's probably extremely likely that they will be adjusted in some way, shape, or form prior to any leasing activities. I know that BOEM has been eager to get those task force actions up and running, but I think that is being held up by the governor of South Carolina to recommend someone to that task force or to assign someone to that task force. So if any of you know the governor in South Carolina well, please let him know that we'd like someone assigned to the task force so they can get moving on the Carolina Long Bay area. And you can see too, as it stands, there are hundreds of thousands of acres that stand to be leased in South Carolina. I think it's close to 1 million. Again, that's so much area that it is very likely that those will be reduced, changed, and adjusted as that task force moves on, because those areas are probably a little too large for lease just yet. I put this slide in here. I'm not going to go through it now, but wanted you all to have access to it. It's a visual of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management leasing process for offshore wind. And I think it's important because it gives you a sense of the kinds of assessments, the kinds of discussions and research that go into identifying leasing areas. It's all about deconflicting. There is now the DoD clearinghouse, the Department of Defense siting clearinghouse is the entity that works with land-based wind across the country, works with individual bases, brings those base commanders, base leaders in to talk about any potential impact from a wind farm, and then identify either mitigation or just understanding that a wind farm isn't going to be compatible with military activities in a certain area. That agency is now also involved in the BOEM lease process. So the Department of Defense Siting Clearinghouse is now also the agency that will bring in local base leaders, any potential military installation or asset that would be affected by an offshore wind farm, just to make sure that that process is well coordinated and working up front. So I have here pictures because I think one of the crazy things about offshore that most people don't understand is just the size and scale of the components. So when we're talking about a 12 megawatt turbine, the foundations might not be that much bigger. These are jacket foundations, which were used. The first offshore wind farm in the U.S. was constructed off the coast of Rhode Island, and they did use jacket foundations like these. They're constructed in the Gulf in Louisiana and then barged up to Rhode Island because they only needed five or six of them. No, five. It's a five. I always get it mixed up. It's a 5 turbine, 6 megawatt each wind project. Here you can see a blade. So this is for one of the GE 12 megawatt turbines. This is a 12 megawatt blade, 350 feet long. GE is just now testing the first, it's called the Hallade 12 megawatt turbines, but you can see here, these components cannot be manufactured inland. You cannot transport these things via rail. You cannot transport them on a road. They can only be transported on the water. They are much, much, much too large to be transported anywhere else. So the important, the reason for that note is that everything has to be done on the coast. So this is a significant economic development opportunity for ports. Ports up and down the East Coast are fighting over who's going to get these new blade manufacturing facilities, who's going to get the tower manufacturing, nacelle manufacturing, assembly. These things right now, with just the level of commitment, which is about 22 gigawatts of offshore that states up and down the East Coast have made, all of that being Virginia up north. We don't have any commitments, North Carolina south. But with those commitments, the U.S. expects a minimum of $70 billion of new investment in ports and manufacturing facilities for the industry. So benefits to coastal communities, I started touching on that, but it's significant and really important. So supply chain, I just mentioned $70 billion for 18 to 22 gigawatts. Tourism is always a concern. And so far, what we've seen is from the studies that are out there is that as long as wind farms are about 10 nautical miles offshore, there are no significant impacts to tourism. And in fact, could be quite the opposite. So University of Rhode Island noted a 19% increase in occupancy and a $3,500 annual rental income. This came from VRBO, Airbnb sources after Block Island was constructed. And so this, I think it's also significant to note that Block Island is an area that is much like the North Carolina beach tourism and certainly some of South Carolina, where beach tourism consists almost exclusively of large rental homes that are right on the water. And so kind of gives you a similar sense of the type of tourism there. University of Delaware estimates the first regional development will draw 13 million tourists during its first 5 years. And then construction jobs cannot be, again, this kind of thing cannot be understated. This is part of the $70 billion, but we're talking about 5,000 construction jobs for a 352 megawatt project. And right now we're talking about, 22 gigawatts of offshore wind being developed in the next 10 years up and down the East Coast. So tens of thousands of jobs. And then port revitalization, this is obviously an opportunity for ports to diversify. And we've seen a number of ports up and down the East Coast already investing heavily in upgrades specifically to meet the demands of this industry. There's a lot of reinforcements that need to be made, dredging to deepen portside quay and canals. But the size of these components is such that we really will need pretty specific facilities to be developed and built for these projects. I'm going to do a light touch on policy. Again, this is one of the slides I put in there just for people who are curious. If you kind of want to get a sense of some of the things that are and are not happening. On the federal side, there have been a couple of proposed bills that would extend the offshore wind is primarily served by the investment tax credit, so the same tax credit that solar receives. And there have been discussions of extending the tax credit specifically for offshore wind, just because the idea for a tax credit is that you help the industry out on the front end so that economies of scale can be built and really get once the industry is up and running, those tax credits are removed. So there have been a couple of proposals for a federal extension of the ITC for offshore wind specifically. At the state level, how do you get offshore wind? Offshore wind is, at least in the Southeast, right now, it is definitely more expensive than land-based wind, than solar, and a lot of other resources. But at the same time, what we've seen in the Northeast is that when larger and larger commitments are made and economies of scale can be leveraged, there are some of the projects that are under development in Massachusetts, talking about 6 cent, 7 cent a kilowatt hour offshore wind. There are a number of contracts in, I would say anywhere from 6 to 10 cents a kilowatt hour up in the Northeast. Maryland, I think they're around 11 to 14 cents, and that's because they have, along with they require a local build percentage of the wind farm be built locally, and that makes it much more expensive. So the more requirements that you put on the wind farm, the more expensive that's going to get. So that's what we've seen in Northeast, in the Mid-Atlantic, and hopefully we'll continue to see those costs come down the way that they have in Europe. But because offshore wind is a little bit more expensive than other resources, it does require state portfolio. It does require mechanisms that effectively either encourage through policy or other direction that says offshore wind, we need to build offshore wind because of the economic development benefits, because of the resource diversification. One of the fantastic things about offshore wind, honestly, is the permitting, right? You can permit a 2,400 megawatt project in much more quickly and easier than you could 2,400 megawatts of land-based wind. To get 2,400 megawatts of land-based wind, you're going to go through a lot more NIMBY issues, and you're not going to have one plot of land in the Southeast that's large enough for a project of that size. So renewable portfolio standards, some have wind carve-outs we've seen. These are just policies that we've seen up and down the East Coast. Executive directives have been really important in the Northeast, including energy roadmaps that identify offshore wind as an important resource. Research and investment, I mentioned earlier, investment in ports can be significant for attracting the industry. And then financing mechanisms such as an OREC is just an offshore renewable energy credit. So that's the mechanism that Maryland has used, and it just gives it's almost like a multiplier for offshore wind within the REC system. And then creating a rate recovery path for utilities. There were a couple of bills in South Carolina that were floated over the last few years that would have done something like this. So saying, okay, if the utility determines that offshore wind is a resource that they want to explore and build, then they are allowed rate recovery on that. That's effectively how Virginia is going to develop their. They've got 5,200 megawatts of wind that has been deemed in the public interest. In the public interest effectively allows rate recovery for those resources. Additional policy considerations, I already mentioned, administration that certainly impacts how BOEM is, what BOEM's priorities are, especially in terms of existing leases, new leases, and their development plans. In North Carolina, we've seen a number of issues pop up in the legislature, kind of bringing the military into. I touched on the Department of Defense site and clearinghouse earlier. North Carolina has had a couple of anti-wind bills that kind of use the military as cover for those bills that would have killed. I mean, we had a moratorium in the state of North Carolina on wind for 18 months, which did put a good damper on wind development in the state. So that can be significant. House Bill 484 mentioned here, that's actually just the wind permitting bill, the state level permitting bill that has a number of requirements that no project has even attempted that process yet. So just an uncertainty there. The Mountain Ridge Protection Act is a 1984 law that that dictates that you can't build anything over 4 stories on a ridge that's over. There are a bunch of caveats, but it's effectively a ridge over 3,000 feet, and ridge is defined based on the delta between the surrounding area and the ridge, the high point. But it effectively, it does a pretty good job of effectively outlawing wind in some of the windiest areas in North Carolina, which are in the mountains. We've seen some of those locally pop up in Virginia as well, not in South Carolina. Jobs always a consideration. And so that's important. Demand, I'll just touch on this really quickly. You guys have probably gone through this a lot in some of your discussions, but it's corporate demand is really what's driving the addition of new wind and solar right now. Utility mandates, I think, are going to be more important in the Southeast, but across the country, it really has been C&I purchases and the C&I demand that is ensuring that we continue to build more and more resources, and that some of those resources will move us toward wind in the Southeast. So that is what I have. Kelly, let me know how you guys are doing Q&A, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
If anybody has a question, they can either pop off mute or pose it in the chat box that you've been using, and we can read it to Katharine, or feel free to just pop on and ask her yourself.
Hey, Katharine, this is Jason, and you may have mentioned this, but I may have missed it. What is the typical capacity factor today for these wind plants and wind farms? Has it gone up significantly over the last couple of years?
Yeah, that's a great question. It has actually, because of technology advancements. So I think average capacity factor is much closer to 40 now. Now that's not the case in the Southeast. Southeast capacity factors are going to be more in the mid 30s for land-based. Now offshore projects capacity factors are closer to 50, and the generation timing is just steadier across the board. And like I mentioned, land-based wind is heavier at night. Offshore wind generation profile is going to be heavier during the day.
Okay, yeah, awesome. Thanks. I know that, as we kind of get these turbines up higher in the air, your wind is going to be blowing for a lot longer time and more steady. So getting that capacity factor up is going to be incredibly important, as it has to compete with, other types of fuel sources that are on the market today too.
Yeah, and if we could develop wind at 140 meters, in a cost-effective manner, absolutely capacity factors are going to be closer and over 40. It's really just a matter of, being able to deliver technology that is cost competitive at that height, because if you just build a steel tower, for those of you who are engineers, and apologies, I don't know a ton about backgrounds, you would need exponentially more steel just to add that extra 40 meters of tower. And so it's completely cost prohibitive. So the technology is evolving toward, okay, can you change the shape of a tower? If you change the shape of a tower, can you actually produce it on site? So there are some technologies right now that are working on producing towers on site that are doing a concrete base with a steel tower. But once we get to the point, and then the second piece of that is permitting, because and permitting, this would be more from an FAA and visual standpoint, right? The higher you go, the more you get into airspace that FAA may have issues with. You also certainly make these things much, much more visible. And so if there is going to be pushback from that standpoint, the higher you make them, the more you're going to have community turnout saying, well, what are these things going to look like? We're seeing that in Virginia right now. There's a wind farm called Rocky Forge in Virginia that's actually going to be Virginia's first wind farm, first land-based wind farm. They now have an offshore wind farm, but it'll be their first land-based wind farm. And they're looking at hub heights of 110 meters. And so, the county commissioners in that area, they want to know what it's going to look like, and they can look at renderings, but they don't have a lot of other examples to walk around and actually see on the ground. So, that'll be interesting as hub heights evolve.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I hate to monopolize all the time here, but I do have one just follow-up question based on something that you said that really got me thinking of, as the hub heights go up, we typically see, like on your screen now, this type of a wind turbine where you have very large, 3 very large vanes that are really long. Are there other types of designs that are kind of better suited for higher hub heights, like a helical design or something like that, or are people kind of looking in R&D space that might better be suited for that?
Those have actually been looked at for lower hub heights, and
Okay.
not because it's better at capturing the wind, but just because it's less impactful to the surrounding area. But no, I think the tri-blade design that you see is what is really what's being looked at for large scale manufacturing for both land-based and offshore. And that as we get into, let's see, if there's a turbine under development right now, can't remember who is developing, but one of the manufacturers is looking at a 16 megawatt turbine.
Wow.
Yeah, so we've got, I think, 12 and 14 right now that are under construction. And then next up is 16. So these things are just going to get bigger and bigger, but it is all the tri-blade design.
As the megawatts increase and these get bigger, does that impact O&M costs?
Not that much, which is why you do it.
Okay.
It really just impacts capital costs, and so you've got to space them a little further apart. But no, I mean, the economies of scale are significant.
Okay. I better bow out and let some other people ask some questions now.
Sounds good. We got plenty of time.
Okay.
I don't see anything else popping up in chat. Did anybody else have a question they wanted to ask?
Katharine, this is David. While we're waiting for others to formulate their questions and pose them, could you talk with us a little bit about the research that occurs in the region? I know with Clemson, we have one of the world's foremost wind turbine test facilities, but if you could chat a little bit about some of the front end stuff, some of the thinking and the intellectual property that's developed in our region, I think people would find that interesting as well.
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that. There actually is a pretty good network of academic research in the In the Carolinas. I think the Clemson facility that David mentioned is probably the most prominent. So Clemson on the coast has a turbine test facility that can test generators up to 15 megawatts. Now, when that was constructed, obviously nobody was thinking anything would ever be over 15, or at least not in the next 20, 30 years. That test facility came about through ARA funds. Folks remember the American Reinvestment, it was the Obama era stimulus. And they were, that administration was really trying to spread the love in terms of wind research investment. And so a lot of people were really surprised. Well, why did we put a turbine test facility in South Carolina, which doesn't have any wind and may not ever have any wind? But that was really about trying to bring assets to regions in the wind space that weren't as likely to get them otherwise. So I think it's been a really successful program for Clemson and for South Carolina in terms of attracting additional research. And so there are a number of folks at Clemson, both at the turbine test facility and at the university, and then in surrounding universities. There's a professor at Coastal Carolina University, his name's Paul Gaze, who does significant research in the kind of the wind modeling space and the ocean modeling space, and has really tried over the last decade to get more resources out on the ocean, not just kind of wind resource assessment on the ocean, to learn more about various weather patterns, wave patterns, and to further quantify the wind resource that exists off our coasts. There's a lot of research in North Carolina. UNC Chapel Hill has, again, it's more of a resource assessment group that has done a lot of the resource characterization for offshore wind in North and South Carolina and further out. So certainly good research. Trying to think of who else. Some of the things that we talk about a lot where we're coming from is also the supply chain aspect of wind. And North Carolina, South Carolina are actually home to some pretty significant supply chain assets that you wouldn't necessarily expect in the Southeast. So PPG and Sartex are responsible for a large portion of the world's fiberglass. So it's fiberglass roving. So PPG in South Carolina actually, they manufacture the spools. It's just like a giant thread of fiberglass, and then that is sent over to a company called Sartex in Huntersville, North Carolina, just north. And Sartex weaves that fiberglass into proprietary patterns that each of the blade manufacturers have designed. And then that is sent to blade manufacturers around the world. I mean, they send that product everywhere. And then the blade manufacturers use that to lay in their molds, put various polymers, mix that with various polymers, and then that creates the actual blades that are then shipped again around the world to various wind farms. So definitely some R&D assets in those manufacturing facilities as well.
Hi, quick question building off of that about manufacturing as well. I know there's been some discussion recently about concerns about end-of-life recycling. Is that anything we're also looking at potentially with the supply chain discussions for the North Carolina or the East Coast area?
Yeah, we've seen an uptick in discussions around that as well. And it's really interesting. So there certainly are, you imagine these wind blades, they've got a useful life of around 20 years. What I would say to that is they're inert. Right now, they almost inevitably have to be landfilled. There are There are efforts to recycle them, but you can't, because, so I mentioned the process involved in the polymers. It's polymers, heat, fiberglass, and molding that all into an extremely hard shell for these blades. They're very difficult to break, right? You want them to be difficult to break. They've got to, withstand a lot of impact over the course of 20 plus years to generate energy. So that means they're really expensive to break and to kind of turn them into something else. But there are efforts to figure out how can you upcycle those. And then there are R&D efforts right now within the blade manufacturers to figure out how they can develop a blade that could then be melted back at different temperatures to extract the polymers in the same form that they were put in, so that you could then take the fiberglass, recycle that, take the polymers, recycle or reuse that. But right now, over 80% of a turbine is steel and can be recycled. So the vast majority of a turbine within the tower and the nacelle can and is recycled, and that's very valuable material. So there are efforts to recycle, but when you think about the life cycle of a blade, I think it just comes down to every form of energy has an environmental impact. Burying, right now, these blades have to be landfilled or buried. They are inert. They are totally safe. It's certainly easier and cheaper than burying, byproducts like coal ash or dealing with other kind of fossil fuel byproducts. So having, finding a place to landfill some of these assets that are no longer in use, while it certainly makes for some interesting pictures, it's really, in the course of energy generation, has not been a significant issue to date. So I'm happy if you have additional questions or something else I missed on that to chime in more.
No, that was great. Thank you.
So we can't applaud, but let's give Katharine a thumbs up.
Yes, thank you, Katharine.
For her presentation today. Thank you so much. It was great, Katharine. It's great to see you.
Yes, likewise. Well, thank you all for having me. I hope it was useful and helpful. And I'm always happy if those of you have follow-up questions or, didn't want to chime in because you thought you had a question that maybe others knew the answer to. I'm always excited to talk about wind. So don't hesitate to reach out.